Hey everyone, and welcome to Azure Functions University. My name is Mark Dijker, and today I'm here with Stacy. Hi, Stacy.
Hello there. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm very thankful that we've worked together on this lesson and that you're joining now for co-hosting. How are you doing?
It's really cool to be here. I'm not doing bad, thanks. It's a day building Lego is a fun day. Formula One's just started. Life's good.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a good weekend. Yeah, I enjoyed it as well. Yeah, I did some nice pixel drawing and then writing an article actually also about Azure Functions University. And then some last minute fixes, as usual.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, indeed, yeah, it's pretty good. All right, let's quickly share my screen, and let's go over the lessons as we usually do. So we have 8 lessons up to now. This is number 8, and what we've done so far is we have a lesson about HTTP triggers. We have lots of lessons about Azure Storage for the blobs and the queues and the tables. We have a lesson about Cosmos DB. We had our first TypeScript related lesson about durable functions. And today we will be talking about configuration and mostly app settings. And as you can see, we have lots of ideas for new lessons, and we're still just scratching the surface. So there are a few more ideas in the issues list on GitHub. So if you have more ideas about new lessons, you can submit an issue there. If you want to contribute, please let me know. And we're always looking for people to contribute lessons or maybe do a translation, because we started out with .NET functions, but we're also doing TypeScript now, and we'll be doing Python and also PowerShell. So there's lots of opportunity for you to chip in if you want. So let's move over to the configuration lesson. So it's a combination of Stace and myself who are going to discuss the content. We'll briefly talk about the prerequisites. Then Stace will have a say about why do we actually use, why do we need configuration. And then I will show where you can find the application settings in Azure, in your function app resource. And then we'll both do a couple of demos of using custom application settings. Then I'll show how you can use the Azure CLI to manage your application settings for your function app. And then Stace will show another service. It's called the App Configuration Service in Azure, and how you can combine that with Azure Functions. And then we have a homework assignment, and as usual, we have a couple of links where you can read more information. Let me still do the prerequisites, and then we go over to you, Stace. So prerequisites for this lesson are we're going to use the Azure CLI. You're also going to use the Azure Functions core tools, and you should have the core tools if you have the Azure Functions extension loaded in VSCode. Also going to use the VSCode itself. And since we want to publish and manage our settings to an actual deployed function app in Azure, it's also nice if you have a function app already deployed in Azure. If you don't have that, there is a dedicated lesson about deployment, so you can always look that up. So let's move over to you, Stace. Why do you use configuration?
Yeah, thank you. So configuration, it's one or more values that when read into your application at runtime can change the way that it runs or change the data sources that it uses. And we need it because when we run applications locally, we run them against a known environment. We know the location of all the resources we need. And if the code is staying on our machine, we also know all of our secrets. In the early years of software development, configuration, it wasn't as important for smaller applications as it is now. Production and development environments looked really similar. And in my experience, for the smaller apps, there was only ever one production environment. You deployed your code and hey, it just worked. It didn't work for larger applications though. And in this day and age, it doesn't really work at all. As applications became larger, as applications became more complex and more distributed, as they were deployed to more diverse environments, you, the developer, lost knowledge of where and how your application was going to run. You could get around this by making a change to your application and recompiling it for each environment that you deploy to. But that's a lot of extra manual work, toil, and it introduced a lot of risks because what you're running on your test environment is no longer what you're running on your production environment. It is literally different code. It's not a realistic approach. Solution to this is to introduce configuration settings to your application, something that can be changed externally to your code and allow the same code to run in multiple different places and change the behavior per place. That is, environment-specific settings for certain values in your code and setting it at runtime, not at compile time. So a few examples of the type of data that we might want to separate from our code. Connection strings pointing to a database. It's never the same on production as it is on test or when you're developing locally. The execution mode of the application. When you're running on the development environment, the test environment, the production environment, you may want it to do different things. You may want different levels of logging or different features turned on. Your API URLs, kind of similar to the connection strings. If you're deploying to a production environment, there's a good chance that your APIs are going to be in a slightly different place than they are when you're running on test, development, or even your local machine. And finally, service account details. What should your account run as in all of these different environments? And that last one brings us to another issue, and that is security. Our code, it no longer just lives on our own machine. Those days are gone. It lives in source control systems, such as Azure DevOps, GitHub, etc. And when you put sensitive information into these source control systems, even in a private repository, it's a security risk. Anybody with access to that repository now knows the sensitive information about all of your environments. Should your repository be public, the risk is even greater. So instead, we should make sensitive information, those secrets, accessible via configuration variables, allowing each environment to use and know its own secrets and not allow them to leak outside of our application. Keep those secrets private to the place where they should be. Now, when you're starting to write your application, a good tip is to start using these configuration settings from the word go. If you make everything configurable from the start, then that sensitive information, you're not going to miss it if you write everything hard-coded first and then try and clean up after yourselves as you start to do the deployments. Now, function apps themselves have a lot of built-in settings, so I'm going to pass back to Mark now, and Mark can take us through a few of them that are available to us.
Cool. Thanks, Stace. Yeah, especially I like your tip. So immediately when you start building your app, make sure you're using app settings neat from the start.
Start the way you mean to go on.
Yeah, okay, exactly. So that's I think the most important thing to get out of there. So where do these application settings live when you're dealing with Azure Functions? Here I'm showing a function app that comes from a template that is used in one of the earlier lessons, the deployment lesson. It's a very basic HTTP trigger function. And at the moment, it doesn't contain any specific settings, but where you can find these settings, if you scroll down here and underneath the settings, there's configuration. And the configuration then is divided into 3 parts. So we have the application settings. I'll do those last. There are the function runtime settings. Well, as the name implies, and that's about the runtime. In this case, it contains the specification of which runtime version will be used. So which Azure Functions runtime is running your function code. There's not a lot of options here. It's either the 1 or 3, and the 1 is used for the full frame .NET solutions. And the version 3 is the latest one. So maybe so a while ago, version 2 was also still available, but right now you can only deploy version 1 or version 2 or 3. So the tilde means always use the latest version of 3, or tilde 1 means always use the latest version of 1. You can actually fix the runtime version to a specific build of the Azure Functions runtime. And that could be useful in case maybe there is a bug with the latest Azure Functions runtime, and you know that the previous version didn't contain the bug. And then you can specify one of the built-in application settings to make sure you're using a fixed runtime version. The other runtime setting you can specify is to keep control of your costs. So it's actually quite interesting why it's here, because there are also other cost management aspects in Azure. But you can actually set your daily usage quota in here. So so if you're on a budget, or maybe you don't want to extend the free limit you have, because I think the free monthly limit in gigabytes a second is, I think, 400,000. So you can actually specify a quota. So when you're doing your proof of concept and you don't want to run over that free amount, you can specify that here. The last one, the general settings, is only available for Windows machines. So if you're using the Linux machines, then you won't have the general settings. And what is there? It's stuff about the underlying platform. So in this case, it specifies the business which you're running. It specifies something about IIS. If FTP is enabled, things about HTTP, which version is used, if you're using WebSockets, something about debugging. I'll definitely cover this in a separate lesson. And if you're using client certificates. So these things you usually don't get in contact with immediately, but it's important to realize that they're there. So let's get back to the application settings. So Azure Functions will always have a set of application settings by default, because they're mandatory, they're required by the resource. And things like that include the Functions extension version, and there you'll see something you've seen before, because that's the tilde 3 again. And so this version can actually override the setting which we saw here, the runtime version. So if you want a more specific version of the Azure Functions version, you can specify it here. Another very important one is the Functions worker runtime. And in this case, we're talking about .NET. So this is a .NET function. So this function app can only contain .NET-based functions. But that could also be indeed JavaScript or PowerShell. So other types are definitely possible. I won't cover all of these application settings, because they can be quite a lot. I actually have some documentation about all these settings, and that's also in the lesson. So this page, the app settings reference for Azure Functions, describes all the built-in settings that are available, and some of them are there by default, but others you can use to have a bit more control on how the Azure Functions runtime is operating. There is another section called connection strings underneath the app settings, but the connection strings are not for all type of connection strings. They're really specific if you use Entity Framework. So we are not using Entity Framework in this lesson. I'll also keep that for another lesson. But if you're using Entity Framework, then your connection string should be here. But if you're using other types of connection strings, such as for Azure Storage, this Azure Web Job Storage is also a connection string. Other types of connection strings should just be part of the application settings. I think that's all I wanted to say about the available application settings in the portal. So let's move over to you again, Stace.
Yeah. So now that we know where to find all of these application settings, and this is where we can also add some of our own, how can we actually use those settings in our application? And how do we debug locally when we are using them? And in the following exercises, we're going to make an Azure Function application. We're going to be doing that within Visual Studio Code. We are going to be making a HTTP trigger, and we're going to be reading a setting from our local settings using the configuration tools that are available to us. And after that, Mark is going to go through how we can deploy these into Azure from our local machine so we can take those settings forward. So we're going to start off just by creating a new Azure function. And if I can use Visual Studio Code on a smaller screen than I'm used to, I have installed the Azure plugin to Visual Studio here, and it allows me to scaffold up a new function out of the box. So let's do that one now. And first of all, I'm in an empty folder, so we do want to create a new project. And then I get to fill in some important details. So we're going to be writing C#. We're going to be using .NET Core 3. The tooling and the runtime for .NET 5, I believe it's in preview at the moment, but we're not touching that just yet. So
Indeed,
let's stick to 3. We're going to be running a HTTP trigger, and then we need to give it a name. So I have that on this screen here. You don't want to see me mistype everything, so I have a few code snippets that I'm going to be bringing across. And then the namespace that we want to use by default, we'll bring that one across too. And we're going to be running that Azure Functions University demo configuration. The last one is the access rights to the function, and we want to set that at the function level. So in theory now, we should have... Come on, you can do it, little machine. There we go. We now have a scaffolded Azure function that we can edit a little bit so that we can start using configuration settings. Now, the first one I'm going to do is just a little bit of homework. And let's just get rid of these messages down here. Thank you. The first thing we're going to do is change this attribute, this function name attribute. And we're just going to change that to use the name of the class that we're in, just to make sure that it always matches when we deploy into Azure. The next one we're going to do is just basically delete this entire function because we don't want any of the scaffolded code. I have some far better code to bring across. It is a whopping 2 lines of code, and let's just indent that a little better. And what this code is going to do is read our environment variable that we're going to call configuration value, and we're just going to return that to the front end. Now, I haven't done anything with that yet. So what happens if I run this right now? Let's fire up the function. Let's see if I can fill the dead air whilst my computer tries to actually do a build and stream at the same time.
Doing good so far, yeah.
It's always so much quicker when you're not actually streaming at the same time as building.
Exactly, yeah.
There we go. So that's, of course, opened up in the wrong window. So let's bring that over to the right screen. There we go. So you can see we get our configuration value here, and it's empty because it doesn't find anything. Good thing here, it doesn't go boom if it can't find the configuration value. Bad thing is we just get a null returned. So let's close this up and stop debugging. And let's add that variable that we want. Now, inside of our project, we have this local.settings.json file. As you can see, it isn't actually included into our check-ins. It's included in the gitignore file, so this is never stored unless you change that. And this is values which I only want to see on my machine. Out of the box, we get a few values to allow the scaffolded function to run locally on our machine, the type of runtime that we're using, .NET, and a link to the Azure Web Job storage. What we're going to add is that configuration value that we were just talking to. And it is just one value, and we're just going to say, this is set in local.settings. So let's rerun this function now. And is this going to be quicker the second time around? We hope so.
So
yeah,
much quicker.
almost. Yeah. Kind of.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to note that in your local settings, you also see the functions worker runtime. So you also already see that it needs to know that this is a .NET runtime function. So if you would remove that, and the runtime would be confused, if, hey, what kind of function am I trying to run here? So this is already required locally.
Okay, and now when we run it, and of course the browser still opens in the wrong screen, because why would it remember? We now get configuration value. This is set in the local settings. So just a couple of lines of code. The bit that I really love about using these configuration values, it's not hard. It's one line of code, very simply get it out, and then you can work with it as you want to. Because having it all locally is awesome, and we need it when we're doing the debugging. But Mark, how do we actually get this up to the portal so that we can actually use these in our real code too?
Yes, exactly. Okay, let me take over again. Here we go. All right. So also using VS Code, a light theme, so to make sure that you can distinguish between Stacy's VS Code and my VS Code. And as you can see, I have Clippy also up and running.
That's so awesome.
I just have to show this because it's using an extension called VS Code Pads, created by Anthony, and it's super nice. And I added a few pads to it. So Clippy I've added, and also Rubber Duck. So yeah, if you don't have it, I think this is mandatory from now on to have this. So I also have my Azure function here. It's not the exact same Azure function, but that doesn't matter. It's an HTTP triggered Azure function. And I'm also using environment variables here. So in this case, I'm reading a message. If the name which I receive is empty, then I want to show a failed message. And if the name is actually filled in, then I want to return a success message. So I've got two variables. I also have those two variables here mentioned in my local settings.json. But of course, this is all local. So where are they? Where do they need to go? Well, they need to be, eventually they need to be here in Azure, in my function app, in this list of application settings. All right, so how can we do that? So there are several ways. The first thing I will show you is how you can use VS Code and the Azure Functions extension. So let me open up the Functions extension. So this is the app that I'm talking about. I've got several apps listed here, but it's my first function app, FA, where I'm talking about. And if I expand that, we'll see several things, but one of the nodes is called application settings. Oh, that sounds good, right? And when I expand that again, then you'll see the same settings that we also see in the portal. So let me make this a bit bigger. So by default, things are hidden in the portal, and things are also hidden here in VS Code. But if you click it, then you see the actual value. So it's good. At least we can see our values. That's fine. But what else can we do with it? If we right-click on the application settings node, you can see we can add new settings. Okay, that's useful. We can download the remote settings. So that means we can download from the portal to our local settings, and we can upload local settings. And that's the thing that we're going to, because we want to add these two local settings, and we want to push them to Azure. So let's select the upload local settings. Then you need to point it to your local settings file. And in this case, since I used it recently, it's already highlighted. So I can select this file, otherwise you browse to the right location. But this is the file I want to upload. Oh, and apparently I've moved things because it's complains that it can't find it. Okay, so let's do that again. Upload. Let's actually do the browsing part. Okay. This is the file. Right. And now we get a message. It's probably a bit tiny on the screen, but it says setting Azure Web Job Storage already exists in my function app. Do you want to overwrite? As you can see, I can't click this away now, but locally, my Azure Web Job Storage field is filled, but it's filled with a value for local debugging. It says use development storage is true. But the value in my function app in Azure is actually a real connection string to Azure storage. So I don't want to override my Azure Web Job storage value with this use development storage local is true, because then my Azure function will break. So I do not want to override that. So no. And now you can see here it's uploading the other settings, because the other settings are either the same. It's the worker runtime, it's the extension version, and there's 2 new ones. So let's wait a bit until it's done. All right, so it's complete. Let's refresh here in the portal to see if it's actually there. Yeah, so we have the message fail, we have the message success. So it actually published our local settings to Azure. So that works. So that's great. And we also see that the application settings node here, the extension, also contains those 2 new settings. So that's perfect. So using VS Code is really quite easy to upload your local settings, but also to add new settings from scratch. But you can also delete or rename or edit them here. So using the extension is I think the most convenient way. But there are other ways to do it. Let me scroll down a bit. Because another way is to use the Functions CLI. So that's the Azure Functions core tools. And the way this works, this Azure Functions extension, under the hood, it's also using the Azure Functions core tools. But we can actually skip the UI and use the command line directly as well. So let me remove them here. So let me now delete those 2 new settings. So, because we are going to add them again, but now using the Functions CLI. Okay, let's remove this because we don't need it. And we see Clippy again, which is of course very, very important. Okay, so now the application settings are gone. We can actually double check here in the portal to see if they are gone. And oh, the message fail is still there. Is that true? Yeah, it's still there. Let's refresh this. Okay, so let's delete it again. Apparently,
is that because you tried to delete 2 at once the first time?
Exactly. I think selecting needs multiple and then deleting them one after another is probably not a good idea. Yeah. So that's a good lesson. So just if you want to delete one, delete them one by one. All right. Okay. Let's close this. So what we can do now using the Azure Functions core tools. First thing we're going to do is type func settings. Then we can see what we can actually do with function settings. So we can do several things. We can add a new local app setting. So that's very important to understand the context. So using the Azure Functions core tools like this, func settings, you are managing your local settings. So you're adding or removing your local settings JSON. You can decrypt a file or encrypt a file. You can also delete the settings, and you can list all the available settings. So let's try listing it first. Lists. Oh. That's a good point. You need to be in the correct folder, because now I'm just in the root folder of my function app deployment repository. But I need to go into the source folder, and then I need to go function folder. So now I'm in the correct folder. So now I'm in the root of the function app itself. And so it should be in the same location where the host.json and the local settings JSON is. All right. now settings list. Now it returns me all of the keys which are there. It won't show me the values, but at least it shows me what settings are there. All right. So if you want, you can also add a new value now. So we can do func settings add new setting, new value. Now it added a new value. So let's do the list again. Right, so now we have a new setting here. You can also double check that in the local settings.json file. And there we see indeed a new setting, new value. So that works. Now we're still doing stuff locally. So now we want to actually publish or push the settings from our local function app to Azure. So let's do that. Before you do this, you need to make sure that you have access to Azure. So if you haven't done so already, you can Azure AZ login. Then it will take you to a new browser window where you can log into Azure. I already did that, so I'm not doing it again. But it's an important step for now because we're not dealing with stuff locally anymore. Once you are logged into Azure, now we will use a slightly different command, func. But now we're not doing stuff locally, but we will go to Azure. So func Azure function app, and we will publish our app. We need to type publish. Then we need the name of the function app. Let me copy paste that. So it's this. So the name. And the final thing that we need to add is publish settings only. And because I already have the function app up and running, I just want to make sure that these settings are published. All right, here we go. This will also take a moment. So it will actually go to a restore and build step because that is what the publish command does. It's actually not necessary because we are only doing the publish settings, but that's the way it works. So again, just as we did the publish from VSCode, we again get the question, the Azure Web Job storage is different between Azure and local settings JSON. And do we want to override the value in Azure? No, because that contains actually the correct connection string, and we don't want to override it with our local connection string. So we do no, but then it will do the rest, because the rest is either the same value or it's something new. So it's perfect. All right. Again, we can go back to the portal to actually see if it worked. Underneath we have the fail and the success and the setting which was added new. So it's all there. Perfect. So that's one way to publish your settings. Another way to interact with your settings and then really interact with them. Completely, so not locally, but really of your function app in Azure is to use the Azure CLI. So let's clear our screen here. So since we're dealing with our Azure resource, you have to make sure that you're logged in. So if you're not logged in, please use the AZ login command. But then if you want to see what we can do with application settings, we can type AZ function app config settings, and then I do the each to just see what kind of help is available for application settings. So there's three things we can do. You can either delete the function app settings, and it doesn't mean delete everything, but you can delete one or more individual application settings. You can list the settings, and you can set, and the set is really a create or an update of a function app setting. So let's do the list first. Let's do list. But we then need to specify the name and the resource group of the function app that we're talking about. So we need to specify a name. And again, the name, I should have it here. Yeah, this one. And we also need a resource group. I'm using the full name, but for name, you can also do the -n, and for group, you can do the -g, but I'm typing it out in full. So what is the resource group? Do I have that still in my base history somewhere? Yes. Right, so we're going to list the application settings of this function app with this name and in this resource group. Okay, so we send the command and we get the JSON response back with some keys. So I'm not going to show that for too long. That contains both the names, if it's a slot setting, and we didn't talk about yet, but we can use deployment slots. But I think that's good for a separate lesson to talk about blue-green deployments. But it also shows, in this case, the values of the applications settings. So it's all there. Perfect. What we now can do, if you want to add a new setting and then skip the local settings. So if you want to add a new setting directly to our function app, we can do as follows. Let me first clear it again and make sure we see clearly. All right. We can do AZ function app config settings, and then we do a set. With set, we can either add a new one or update an existing one. Then again, we have to specify the function name and the resource group. This is the function name. Specify the resource group again. That's this one. I'm really loving the Windows key V. Because I just learned that like a couple of weeks ago, that it has the whole history of your copy settings.
I'm going to have to get used to using them.
Yeah. And the final argument that we need to pass in is then the -- setting. I can still type. Setting. And then the setting is then a key value pair. So you can use these quotes, and then again, another new setting value. Right. So this should now create a new setting with the name, another new setting, and a value of value. Very confusing. Directly in our function app. And if it's completed, it will also show the output as JSON again. So if you wait a second, yes, and there we go. And so when that command completes, it will do a list, because you will get all of the settings back, as you can see. But this is the new one that we added. All right. So being able to do this, let me clear this. Being able to run this command using the Azure CLI is really very useful, because the Azure CLI, you can run it locally, and you can run it in the Azure Cloud Shell, but you can also run it in your CI/CD pipeline. And that's actually what I'm using in this project. So this project is part of the deployment lesson. I've extended that a bit to work also with application settings, because initially no application settings were set. But if you look at the application YAML, we're using GitHub Actions here, and this is our workflow where we deploy the application code to Azure. And one of the last steps, make this a bit bigger, is actually the same command that we just executed. It's the AZ function app config app settings set. So once the application and the application code is deployed, we will actually run this Azure CLI command, and this will set two of the settings, so the success message and the fail message. And by doing this, it's in your pipeline. So you know that this will be run again and again. We briefly touched upon secrets. We won't go we won't show much of it today because we'll do it in a separate lesson. But using this strategy, then it's also possible to use GitHub secrets and push your app settings, but use GitHub secrets as your app settings. So it's also very useful. So then, of course, your secrets will not be visible in your pipeline as it is right now. All right. So far for pushing and publishing all of the local app settings to Azure. I think it's time to introduce another service. Over to you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you. I love that in the pipeline. That's so easy to lay out. I mean, I got to say, YAML isn't my favorite thing in the world, but even I can understand that. That's really quite cool.
Yeah, it is very useful. Yeah, it takes a lot of get used to indeed, but this is very nice. And I still have a slight preference over Azure CLI than other neat ways of managing Azure resources. So I'm a big fan of this one.
No, really cool. But we do have one problem now. And we have the duck.
Ooh,
if you've got Clippy, I'll do the duck with a ghetto blaster. I'm an 80s child, so this brings back memories.
Thank you for using it. Yeah, I love it.
But now that we're deploying all of our application settings, even though we're doing it in the pipeline using those GitHub secrets to make sure that everything stays secure, it's starting to get a little bit complex because we now have configuration which is set per Azure function application. We are setting it inside of the pipeline. It can need to be different in different places. How do we ensure the developers have access to the things that they need locally as well? And these things kind of start to build up. And to get around these drawbacks, we kind of need a central way of storing our configuration to try and simplify it a little bit. And thankfully, we have one. We have the Azure App Configuration Service. And this is a fully managed store that allows us to retrieve that data for any Azure application, which is perfect for a use case here with Azure Functions. More than that, it's also completely encrypted at rest and in transit, and there's lots of native integration with the favorite frameworks out there. And if we use this central place, then rather than keeping all of our environment variables with each of the functions themselves, we now only need to keep one with each function, and we only need our local developers to have one variable too, and that is the pointer to this central place. So what we're going to do now, we're going to create an Azure App Configuration Service inside of the portal, and then we're going to use that inside of the function that we just made so that instead of reading from local settings, we're going to get it from Azure instead. Now, unfortunately, we've got to leave the rubber duck behind a second and switch to our portal. Here we go. And can I make this a little bit smaller? I think that's still just about readable.
Yeah, I think it's great.
I've got a resource group which I've set up here. It's looking rather empty right now. So let's go to this add button and create this central store. So we need to search the marketplace, and we're going to look for a app configuration. There we go. Let's create this one. If I can click in the right place. And we just need to enter a couple of values to get this working. First of all, subscription resource group. It's preset because I did it from inside of a resource group. We need a name. So this is Azure Func Uni app config. Can I use that one? I can use that one. That's cool. We need to say where our configuration is going to be held. And as I'm based in the Netherlands, we're going to run this inside of West Europe. And because I don't want to use all of my credits up just yet, we're going to have this on the free pricing. I'd recommend looking into the pricing details when you do this. Start off with the free, but it does have limitations. And I believe even the standard version is only around €1 per day. So it isn't something which costs the earth to use. So let's review and create this one. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because sometimes Azure resources can create in seconds, and sometimes it can really leave you hanging. This one has taken like 10 to 20 seconds when I've done all of the run-throughs. There we go, it's finished. It's nice when it's that
that's pretty
quick.
quick.
Yeah. And aside from the resource groups, it's one of the quicker ones that I've seen. And then inside of our app configuration, if we have a look at the left-hand side, we're going to dive straight into our Configuration Explorer. Here are our configuration variables, which we have none, so let's create one. Click on the Create button. We have two options here. We have a key value, which is a variable that we put directly into our Configuration Explorer, or we can even put a link to a key vault. We're not going to look at that today, but it's good to know that it's there. So let's create a key value. And then I'm just going to come back over and try and find what I need to put here, because I think I can type this totally wrong and really embarrass myself in a second. Configuration value. I think that's correct. We'll find out in a minute. And this is from the app configuration service. And that is why I do lots of code snippets, because I can make loads of mistakes here. So now we have, live typing is always fun. Yeah. So now we have our configuration. You can see that the value is always hidden by default. We can see what values we want by clicking on this Hide Show Values. And if we need to edit this, we have the ellipsis at the end, where we can edit, we can add a new one, add tags to it. We're going to leave it as is for now and move on to the next step. And that is to use this from within our Azure Function application. So what we need to do is get a link to this app configuration, and we do this by going to the access keys. And here we have our primary and our secondary key. And I just want to quickly talk about these. We have a primary and secondary key, and it allows you to stay secure without interrupting your users. If you need to regenerate your keys to stay a little bit secure, you can switch to your secondary key. Then you can refresh your primary key, switch back to your primary key, and then refresh your secondary key. It's important to make sure that your keys are always secure, and it's nice to know that if you do need to change it, there's no downtime involved for your application. You can do this without costing your users frustration. I'm going to copy this connection string, and I'm just going to bring that into a notepad file that I have running locally. Yep. And now we can go back to our Azure function, and we can start to actually use it. Now, when we use an app configuration service, we use dependency injection to get access to it. And out of the box, that isn't something that we have set up. So we need to add that before we can really get into the function itself. So I'm going to add a new file in the root of my application, and I'm going to call that function startup.cs. And I'm just going to do a couple more things that I forgot, because in order to use this, we do need to add a couple of nugget packages. Yeah. So let's, come on, find the right screen. Come back to our command line. We just need to add a couple of nugget packages. That's .NET add package. The first one we're going to be adding is a Microsoft Extensions Configuration Azure App Configuration package that allows us to use the configuration that we've just added. Did I type that correctly? I did type that correctly.
Yes.
Awesome. I love it when that works. It's a lot less embarrassing. Possibly less fun to watch, but less embarrassing for me. And the second one where we're going to cheat, we're just going to get rid of the one that we just added. And we're going to add the Microsoft Azure Functions extensions. And we need this to get access to that startup. So now we have these two functions, these two packages. We can get started with this function startup. first thing I'm going to bring in is the using statements that we're going to need here. And that's the ones that we've just imported. Next up, because out of the box we don't have a startup for an Azure function, we need to add an attribute to our class. And we need to say that on function startup, use this class. And you may notice that we have a red squiggle there, and that's a red squiggle because we've not created it yet. So let's add the class next. And then we have another red squiggle because we have things that we need to override.
You can type so quickly these days. Wow.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And with almost no errors. Mind you, my indentation leaves a little to be desired. So the first override that we're going to use is configure app configuration, where we get our builder and we can add this, add Azure configuration. And you can do all sorts of things with it. I'd recommend looking it up on MS Learn. Today, we're just going to keep it really simple. We're just going to go for adding the connection string, app configuration connection string. We're going to be adding that in a second. Before we do that, there's one more function that we need to add, and that is for the dependency injection itself. So let's bring our last function in. Let's do the indentation a little bit. And here we can see we're adding this Azure app configuration, adding that to our services so we can use it inside the function. So the next one that we need to do is add our local setting, because we do need, remember, that one setting now to get access to our app configuration service. And that's going to be our app configuration. And then I just need to bring across my connection string. And this points the application up to the Azure in order to get that setting that I've just made. So next step, we need to use it. So we're going to add a new Azure function. So I'm going to scaffold that up here. I'm not going to scaffold up a static web app. I will do an Azure function. We want a HTTP trigger, and this one we're going to call reading app configuration values. We need to give it the same namespace that we had before. Honestly, we do. Where's my namespace gone? Nope. And I believe that's actually wrong. I believe it should be Azure Functions demo configuration. We're going to keep the access rights on function, and hey, presto, we have a new scaffolded function. Now, the first thing that we need to do is to remove this static keyword, because we don't want a static function anymore. We now want a function which we can add a constructor to in order to bring our configuration in. So I guess that would be a good next step. So let's add our constructor. Let's give that some proper indentation. And here we're bringing in an iConfiguration, and we need to use the right using statement for that. There we go. And this just makes it available for us to use. Spot the deliberate mistake here if you can. Then we have our function itself, and we're just going to replace that verbatim with something that looks fairly similar to what we just had. So let's go all the way up to here. And again, let's sort out our indentation. So the function name attribute, we're changing that the same way that we changed it before, just so it uses the class that we're inside of. Then for our function itself, instead of using the environment.getConfiguration, we're just using this underscore configuration, the one that we passed into our constructor, and we're saying get our configuration value out of it, return it to the screen. So if we run this now, and then hope that I've done everything properly. First time I tried this, I did it completely wrong, and I got all sorts of red text. It was awesome. Come on, drum roll, please. Come on, little computer, you can do this. That's green so far. This is good. There we go.
Yes.
So let's open up this app configuration. Of course, it's opening up on the wrong screen again, every time. And here we have it. This is from the app configuration service. So our Azure Functions now able to use this external service. And from now on, we don't need to have reams of values in our local app settings. We can just keep that one pointing to this configuration service.
Cool.
And I believe, if I'm not wrong, Mark, I can say back to you for the homework.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Thanks for showing this this service. Yeah, it looks really promising indeed. Yeah. I've been looking at it not for configuration, but for feature management. I think you were doing the same recently.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think this is a nice step. Yeah, because for the client I'm working with now, we have several apps with their own responsibility, but there is some kind of shared settings around them. So it definitely makes sense to move those settings to a central place where they can be managed.
Yeah, and it's got some really nice ways of setting too. Something that we've discussed in the lead up to this. Rather than when you load the function, it loads the configuration, but you can actually make this dynamic so that when you update the function, it refreshes it and gets the variables for you.
Exactly.
And you can even go one step further than that, which I really love. You can have a configuration which is only there to trigger the refresh. So that if you need to make 4 or 5 changes and they need to be atomic, that you can set all of them. Your function won't see them until you change that last one, which triggers a refresh, and then it gets the whole set of new ones. It's a really cool system to use. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, that's really nice. Yeah, it's really some nice details in it, which go much further than we can touch upon now, but it looks really good. All right. So let's talk briefly about the homework. The homework builds on top of another homework that was about the blob resume. And that blob resume extends the HTTP resume. So if you haven't done any of those, then you might have a bit more homework. But the thing that which you can make configurable now is it was an HTTP trigger one that reads your resume as a JSON file from blob storage, but it would just return the resume as is. But I thought maybe it's nice that you add a customizable, configurable message to that output. So the idea is when you call the function, you do get back the output of your resume, but in addition, you also get back a message field, and that message can contain something like this resume was downloaded, and then on a timestamp. And the thing that you can make configurable is then, of course, this piece of fixed text, and you can put that in a variable. But another thing which is quite useful to put in a variable is the format of this timestamp. And because you might have a certain preference, or maybe it's based on region or culture, that you want this in a certain format. So it's also something you can put in configuration. So yeah, let me know if you've done this homework. You can reach me on Twitter. It's always nice to hear if you're working on this. Then the last point, some more links. Both links point to the official Functions docs and also the app configuration service docs. I will also include a link here on using the app configuration service really dynamically, like we just talked about, because that's in a separate tutorial. So I will include that link as well. Let's briefly go back to the issues of Azure Functions University repo. And with issues, I mean outstanding requests for more lessons. So there are quite a lot. A few have been added about Drupal functions, which will be again in TypeScript, but maybe you want to make them available for .NET. You can help out there. Then we have also some things in mind of some different various tips and tricks which do not fit any other category. We want to do something about local debugging, and as you can see, there are some requests for PowerShell translations and for Python translations. So if you want to contribute to that, you're more than welcome to do so. Right, I think we've covered it all, Stacey. Thanks a lot for preparing the content and for co-hosting. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot myself as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. I've learned a lot doing this too, and it's a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Okay, everyone. We'll probably see you again in 2 or 3 weeks with the next lesson. Until then, bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.